Thank you, Alakananda, PhotoSouthAsia and Archila for inviting me to speak this evening. So just talking about just an introduction to why I thought about the value of an archive, because I think there's something that we associate with value leads to a certain preciousness of how the archive becomes historic and what really gets constructed as a value in both a subjective and an objective manner. I think really, when you talk about the subjective and the objective, it also comes down to how one enters the archive. And when I say enters an archive, it comes back to what our personal relationships are with an archive, whether it's a family archive or whether one's approaching it from a more historic or academic point of view. And another aspect which I'll also be talking about in relation to Dada, the Atal Modi's archive, is about when does it come into being and when do we ascribe the, the notion of an archive to a collection of photographs. One of the aspects that perhaps comes in is the functionality and the form. And we talk about function and form, about whether an archive has been created purely to function as an anthropological or a social documentation, and what the form of the archive may be. So I'll also speak about the materiality of the image in this. Through that, what also perhaps comes up is the utility and how the utility also adds value to the archive. But in this, I think something which a lot of today's and yesterday's talks also spoke about is how an archive moves. How do we create movement in an archive? So I think very often what ends up happening, and this comes back to this idea of preciousness which comes into an archive, is it becomes still, and perhaps we end up suffocating an archive in trying to hold it in a way where it's about who owns the image, about where one keeps things in a historical context. But when an archive opens up, it also brings in the context of how does it move forward into the future of thinking about the images, but also the materiality that exists in what an archive could be. So I think going back to the first aspect of the subjective value of an archive, where this perhaps comes in is with family archives, with friends, and with personal associations, where there's a narrative that one can ascribe to the archive itself, which is a subjective form of how we value it. But there's also that preciousness, which I'll talk about with Dada's archive over here, where a subjective archive often might contribute to the stillness of an archive. So then what happens when one has to step away from it, and who comes in at that point? And that also perhaps brings in the objective value then, because the objective value could come in through either research, interpretive analysis, or data. And when I say data, it comes down to understanding where the value of an archive could be looked at more as a form of data collection, because then suddenly moving away from the archive being looked at just not only for the images, but also what it offers historically as data, and then what does that hold in terms of value. And in this subjective and objective value of the archive itself, what becomes quite important is where absence holds this value. Because very often what we end up ascribing as, the value is based on the presence and not so much on the absence of what may have been left out from being encountered in this archive. I'll be looking at this through two archives. One is Tapan Modi's grandfather, Tapan sitting here right in front, Dheeraj Lal Modi, whose archive I'll speak about in relation to materiality and its history. And the second is Kalpesh Lathigra's Indian Photo Studio, which was an archive of photographs, a box of photographs that he encountered in Chor Bazaar in Bombay. So Dada, an accidental pictorialist, was an exhibition that Tapan Pandit, who worked on restoring the archive, and Sana, who worked on this with them, invited me to curate the archive and the exhibition at the NCPA Piramalad Gallery last year. And when Tapan first started telling me about how he discovered this, he spoke about how the archive was something which for him was precious, first because it was his grandfather's archive. But also for him, he talks about how this heirloom turned from what he calls a blessing, turned into a mission. And a mission really which, as we'll see, came about through what he discovered about about his grandfather's history, which he had no idea about this part of his life, which for him was absent all through. So Dheeraj Modi passed away in 1990, and Tapan discovered a suitcase in his family home in 2012. When he opened the suitcase, he saw all these photographs in there, which he had no idea his grandfather had been a photographer, and sees a label called the Photographic Society of India on one of the on one of the images, and also a portfolio. So he makes his way to the Photographic Society of India, which still has an office in Bombay, and finds out that his grandfather was one of the founding members of the PSI. And he was a founding member along with his brother Sumanlal Modi in 1937, and there were 18 other members who formed this group. And Dheeraj Modi photographed between the 1930s and the 1940s. His profession otherwise was that he was an expert dyer at the Indian Bleaching and Dyeing Company in Prabhadevi at the mills. And it was only on when he came home in the evenings after the family had retired, or on weekends, where Dheeraj Modi and Sumanlal Modi turned the corridors of the house into a dark room and experimented with photography as a medium. And this included techniques, perspectives, and the different possibilities of what the camera could do and what it meant to really create in a dark room. And really, this is where also where I'll start talking about the materiality of the image. And when I say experimented, it wasn't only a single image that they were looking at, but they were also photographing landscapes across India. And I don't have images of that over here because I've only focused on the materiality that they were working on. But they were also perhaps what might be looked at as the early pictorialists in the country. Because it was during the colonial period that they were getting photography magazines from the UK. They were being able to participate in, and as you'll see in the caption over here, in international photography exhibitions. He'd won awards as well for his images. But alongside this, there was this very meticulous way of understanding what the photograph could be as a material. And this is also something where one starts looking at the photograph as a material object, which becomes central to how we start understanding the archive, not purely just as the image itself. And in looking at images such as Dheeraj Modi's archive, what we then begin to ascribe as value is also the history of photography in India in the 30s and 40s. So it wasn't just one image, and this is, of course, something that he experimented with. Like over here, you'll see there's 6 different prints, and behind every image, behind every photograph, he's meticulously written on which camera, the exposure, the size, what he's used as a medium, because almost his way of making sure that he had written down his process of the experiments that he was using. So again, just turning now, as you can see from the subjective, which was really this photograph, this suitcase of photographs that Tapan found, to looking at it objectively of where it stands historically as a value of understanding why this archive is important, and also knowing what the founding members of the Photographic Society of India were looking at that time. And along with this, there was also a portfolio of, I'll go back to this one. There was also a portfolio of Dheeraj Lal Modi, along with the other Photographic Society of India founders, where all of them had parallel careers. Photography was just something that was a passion for them. And to understand how this was something that was still developing as an experiment, as something that was still coming in as a form of history where photography hadn't become a full-time career option back then, but thinking about what it meant to look at the image and experiment. So this, for instance, and this is also given that Dheeraj Lal Modi stopped photographing in the 1940s after he lost his brother, Suman Lal Modi, which is also why the photography stopped. These images were put away. Nobody in the family spoke about photography after that, and Tapan didn't even know his grandfather was a photographer. But you see the extent to which he and the members took photography seriously, because when he created these, color film was not available in India, in the Indian markets easily till the 1950s, by which time it already stopped. So again, looking at these multiple iterations in which he was he was photographing or experimenting with images. And this again is a still life of a figurine. And when you're looking at his archive, from just looking at only the family photographs, we started looking at the categories that one could assign to it, which also then became, again, the objective value to it, where there were landscapes, there was still life, there were animals. And when one talks about animals, it's again going back to the time at which these were made, movement and stillness, where you had sitters for photography, you had to have stillness in it. But the way he did this was also a challenge on how, well, the next image, which we'll come to, was the risks he took with the image. But say with something like this, which was really still life, you see how much movement there is, and the extent to which they experimented with it. This one, Snatch It. So what you see on your left are very detailed pencil marks, which we hadn't really seen in this image initially. That was only on close observation, and then Tapan's father at the opening of the exhibition told us about how he'd watch his father spend hours drawing and marking out each detail of the image, which again today, when one ascribes historic value to this, it's almost something that one wouldn't even consider as being something one needs to do anymore, because it just wouldn't. I mean, looking at these pencil marks, it's just something that one would take for granted is already there. So this is where I think when one looks at the subjectivity moving to objectivity is where this archive becomes important in looking at this movement of how the value shifts. And perhaps this is where Tapan also is talking about this as a mission, where it suddenly moved from being just a family archive into becoming historically important as an archive in the history of photography in India. The next archive that I'd like to talk about, which is an unknown archive, is Kalpesh Lathigra's Indian Photo Studio. So this was in Kalpesh's studio in 2019. I'd gone to see his other body of work, Memoir Temporelle, which he was working on. And he pulled out this box, which he just found on a trip back. Kalpesh is based in London, and he just found this box of photographs at Chor Bazaar in Bombay during his trip, and he said, "What do I do with this? I just saw this box with these passport photographs, and I picked it up, and then it was just there without knowing what was written behind it, not knowing what this collection of images was, but just this curiosity of what these passport photographs could do." For context, also something that Kalpesh does as a professional photographer is that he often takes passport photographs of commissions of portraits that he's asked to make, and that's his way of creating a personal work alongside his commissioned work. So the passport photo is a space of interest for him, even outside of just these images here. But this again became something completely unknown. It was just something that drew him to the image. During the pandemic, I'd taken a few of these photographs, but then Kalpesh sent me the back of all of these, which had text on it. And this goes back to something that Anita and Imran was speaking about. What Kalpesh, as an artist of diaspora, has been struggling with is just this imposed idea of what home is, and constantly having to establish himself as being British, but also being Indian. And I mean, that's also where Memoir Temporelle started, where he was in Bombay photographing up close, where one didn't necessarily look at, but he didn't necessarily look at Bombay as being a city um, that he made beautiful, but he normalized why he was over there. But what Kalpesh was also doing parallelly was visiting his hometown, where his grandfather originally was from, which is Junagadh in Gujarat. And every time he go back to Junagadh, he had no connection to Gujarat. He felt alienated over there. He didn't know how to connect it. And it was only last month, well, actually, a couple of months ago, when we were really looking at how um, this this archive becomes a link to connect Kalpesh's the trilogy of India, let's say, in some way, because there's Memoir Temporelle and then there's a Junagadh series. And this becomes a link because what we realized behind these images, the text behind it, is mainly in Gujarati. And this is something he found in Bombay, and there's no connection to why this was in the box together, why most of the people in here have an association with Gujarat and somewhere. Some of the photographs are taken in studios in Ahmedabad. The image text itself, which I'll come to, is in Gujarati, or some of it is in English. But this is also coming back to understanding how this objective value of just a box of photographs became fairly subjective, again, for Kalpesh, in looking at how this link connected Memoir Temporelle and Junagadh for him. Because Junagadh, for him, he was able to understand why he could have a distance from it, but still have a connection between the two, and this becomes an important link for that. But something which became quite important, and this is again coming back to the form of the archive, was at this was at NCPA last month at his exhibition, where he decided to scan and blow up these images as an experiment to understand what the form could do. And this is going back to understanding the image as a material object. For most people who walked into the exhibition, thought that this was Kalpesh's family. And it was a family archive because just by default, to see faces on a wall, to see them in black and white, and also then to think about the assumptions that we have when one looks at images, what could be an archive, but really turning it around to then seeing how we ascribe meaning to images that we see. Was also a play that Kalpesh had, but also it became a way of understanding how this link came in through something completely unknown for him. So this is going back to the details of what these archives were back in the size of the passport images. And here, it's something where the image itself becomes, rather than two-dimensional, one starts looking at the three-dimensionality of the image. Because it's no longer just the front of it, but also the back of it. And the moment we turn to the back, it suddenly becomes what we might ascribe to a passport photograph as data collection. But also going back to how this perhaps was a utilitarian value that was ascribed to this box of photographs. Because while these images help perhaps date when they may have been based on the fashion, the style, and all of this, but when you look at the back of it, they have, it's pre-science, it's about when they passed class, or what may have been their marks. And you start, and then there's one which is from Hamilton Studio, which suggests Bombay. But then there were also some which were from Ahmedabad in this archive. There are lots of them in that box. But then you start thinking about how we start creating narratives based on data that we may not have and that's absent, and start building stories that then allow us to take off from there, which is also perhaps where the archive um, develops a movement in some way. And Kalpesh is now working on a book, which I'm working with him on for this, which is the second book of the trilogy. And we've been talking about what it might mean to work with these images. And while some of them may come back into the book in their scans, we're also thinking about what it might mean to disseminate this back into a public form, because the question of how passport photographs are used is this idea of exchange. And photographs were so often, especially when we look at the passport photograph now, which all of us also use, it's really just a form, a document, a data document. You'll stick it on a form, we'll use it for something. And it's nothing that one looks at as a form of value to hold on to. So how does one put it back into something that could very easily become this precious box that was found into a bazaar and that could be looked at as an archive? Which is a question that one really starts thinking about and struggling with when one, at least we've been struggling with that, of what it might mean to just release this back out there in a public realm and not hold on to it um, in that same box that it was found in. And the last image uh, in this is, if you observe the left of the image, you notice that it's being cut. And this was something that really was quite different, because it's clearly being cut from something that included a second person. It works very differently from the previous image, where it seems more formal. It's perhaps used for job applications, maybe for matrimonial purposes. I mean, one really can't say. This is where you start ascribing meaning to it. But for this one, and you see it's in Ahmedabad, which again goes back to Gujarat, uh, one really starts thinking about what it might mean to cut an image up. And this again goes back to looking at where the value of the archive holds in an image itself and where absence comes in. And while thinking about absence again, and really thinking about the absent archive and the value that comes into the absent archive, it really is where even today when we are thinking of what we might document, and it's going back to this morning's talk, what we end up documenting to keep is also immediately edited out in what we don't want to keep. And where does that then hold on to the objective and the subjective? And who comes in to help us then think through where one is editing things for our future, but also where do we hold on to keeping things that allow for a certain subjectivity based on what we document for ourselves. Thank you.
I actually had a question regarding Kalpesh's work, where this is found imagery, right? Like found objects. And when it comes to such found work, like when it comes into the public realm, I just want to understand the ethics, the considerations around ethics that were taken, and yeah, and also like if the back of the image did not have text, how would it have changed this work?
So I think the second question is something which I think would go back to Kalpesh in some way, but about the ethics part of it, this came up even when during the exhibition, because it was an archive that one found, that he found in Chor Bazaar, and there were other boxes as well of photographs. He consciously chose not to go out and look for these people, because that could have been one thing that would then become a project in itself. But if somebody recognized themselves from this and came back, he said he'd be quite happy to have that conversation with them about it, because the way he found it was already in a public realm, and he just paid for the box and not even for the image itself.
I'm just very curious. how in this box there were so many images which are attributed to different studios. So obviously there must have been some kind of distillation which arrived or pre-arrived into this box before whichever dealer in the Chor Bazaar was selling it. So was there anything that you figured out about that? Why an assembly of there's Hamilton, which is a very well-known photo studio in Bombay. We all know of it. But then there are lesser-known studios, and how did all this get assembled together? That's one. And from the Mr. Modi, I was just very curious, since the grandson is here, how within 2 generations the loss of information of that the grandfather was a photographer, because photography at a certain period was a very haloed, whether profession or practice as a serious amateur, and how and why the family completely buried that. I know you have some explanation that one brother died, but we don't see any work of the other brother. We only see one.
That Tapan might be able to answer. Sumanlal, all these.
Hi, uh, Tapan. So, what actually happened was, think when Dada and Suman Kaka used to work in tandem. Uh, it's unfortunate that Suman Kaka's family hasn't preserved this archive like my pen. There was, in all likelihood, another archive like with their grandson, which was not available anymore. I did actually try to look for it. We've all gone into our attics and kind of pulled out everything. There was one photograph that had Suman Kaka's name on it. And what happened with Dada and Suman Kaka was, why one was was the enterprising one, the other one seemed to be the creative one. Dada seemed to take the creative role in terms of composing the photographs and kind of completing them. What happened was when Suman Kaka passed away, because he was also the younger brother, it was a huge shock. And this is, I'm talking pretty much in retrospective, kind of, we just try to fill in the blanks through the archive, where we went and said, okay, why did you and I have the same question as why was it never mentioned or spoken? We are speculating that it was the stop was so sudden, which was because he completely, there is not one photograph that we have post 1954. And that made us think that, and because we were a joint family at the time, all the responsibilities came onto my grandfather's shoulders. And I think we speculate that it was because of all of that. That one was he completely stopped photography in Nishibort in a way, and the other, the family responsibility is to pop up. Um, it was surprising since he never even spoke or showed his photographs to any one of us. None of us. It was just passing his stories and okay, that are kids today, yes. And then suddenly he oppressed this more or less. We're filling in the blanks to see the story that are running.
And about Kaltesh's, what we again derived based on the backs of these images, this was either for jobs or for some form of college students would be whose marks had been written behind all of them. So this is just 4 or 5 images which I've pulled out, but there are over 100, and all of them have either the degree behind it, which class they passed with. Some of them have the percentages behind it. So it is probably a collection of a group of students or somebody, or perhaps a company that offered jobs based on people's careers. And this is what we were certain based on the connection of data from behind the images.
I was wondering whether you, because it's such a potent material for thinking about the present also, I found a very productive way also of engaging with the idea of passport photos was this fantastic book called Passport Photos by Amitav Kumar. It's so reflective on what is happening in the present, whether it's associated with questions of identity theft, for instance, that we see when biometrics came into play and how they kind of replaced the passport photograph at one level, or even on, I guess what Amitabh brings across is the question of an immigrant experience, how that comes to bear on questions of images that were circulated in official documentation and so on. So I guess my question with respect to that is about the curation of the show at Piramal. Was there a reflection on that and, what these images might mean in the present, so forth?
So given the number of images that we had in this, and there were plenty. So if you look on again, this was really from a visual perspective that we started shortlisting. And both Indian Photo Studio and Junagadh are both works in progress. So we did take that into consideration. But something which we wanted, based on even the curatorial decision of how we hung it, where we placed it, was to have it at eye level, because it wasn't something where one could escape the gaze of the image in some way, which is also something that people came back to, constantly looking at these. So you had to walk through this. And what you see on the left was a more frontal image. It was quite literal in terms of why we put it there. And here it was also where there were images that were facing each other in some sense. And as we were installing these, something which in fact Kalpesh came up with was, when you start speculating about what the intent behind these may have been, and one starts thinking about whether it was for jobs, whether it was for matrimony, you start sort of building these narratives in your mind when you come across some of the images, and even the sequencing of the images. And this goes back to how Kalpesh is also thinking of his own work, which is the title of The Lives We Dream in Passing. Because Memoir Temporelle itself is based on how Kalpesh would, he imagines what his life would have been had his grandfather not moved away from Bombay. And he's worked with models whom he was at that time commissioning for another project, to imagine them as his younger self in Bombay and what his life would have been, which then leads up to this work.
Okay, so with the personal archive, I get the ascribing of emotions and everything, like ascribing a story to what could or could not have been. But how does one go about with a found archive like Kalpesh's show? It's a found archive where we're ascribing stories. I'm not talking about the photos with the marks on the back, because we know there is a purpose behind it. But beyond this particular show, where other found archives, what kind of an importance does it hold, where you're ascribing or imagining or trying to interpret the stories behind it?
I think that's also perhaps where myth gets ascribed to it, and how even when one thinks about oral storytelling, how narratives have passed over time. And that, I think, came up in one of the panels earlier today, where there's not been that meticulous documenting of how something has happened and where it's taken place, but based on an oral history. So for instance, with this archive, Kalpesh has also been writing short stories which will go into the publication to build a narrative that becomes fictional of how these images might be remembered.